hearing what they were interested in. And one of the consistent themes was, how do we manage our public spaces, our digital spaces and digital communities? Oh, thank you. Our digital communities, because that's obviously, that's a challenge in everything you do, frankly, given the craziness of the Twitter sphere and other social media platforms. So we're very pleased to have Mila Mimica. Did I pronounce the last name right?
Mimica, but
Mimica.
Mimica,
Excellent.
like pizza.
Got it.
Yeah.
Mila Mimica and Francis Gonzalez. Mila from KGW and Francis from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Francis is the author of a social media toolkit on suicide prevention for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that is literally just now being published, and it's on your thumb drive. So you are the almost first. Yeah, almost first to get it. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, and thank you to KGW for hosting us all. I kind of wanted to start off with the individual and unique challenges that I myself as a digital journalist run into. We were discussing how in the digital space news is always breaking, so we think it's pretty important that all of us journalists can understand what kind of language should be used in certain situations that may involve suicide, and what kind of toolkits we should be providing to our viewers and our listeners and our readers. So the unique challenges that I was thinking about just in my past few years of reporting, whether or not we should be saying suicide in a tweet when a big breaking news story is occurring that's blocking traffic or it's of interest to thousands of people. So I kind of wanted to discuss that with you and what we should be doing in case something like this happens, whether we should be occurring or mentioning it as a traffic problem of sorts or giving out toolkits and how we should discuss that with our audiences.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and talk about all of this stuff. And one of the things that I do want to note is that this is something that is going to be keep developing over time. The digital space is so new and keeps changing, and we're adapting to it as much as everybody is adapting to it as well. And the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has worked with, as John mentioned earlier, with the social media platforms for years to help them develop their processes and reporting guidelines and support guidelines for how to help people that are in crisis. And we've experienced, having those platforms come to us and say, we're encountering people in crisis, what do we do? And how do we even identify when something is something that requires a certain intervention versus something else? And I have had journalists reach out to me saying, hey, I wrote a piece, it was published, I'm getting these comments, what do I do? And that's a terrifying thing to encounter, right? Especially, I'm sure the sense of personal responsibility for a piece that you authored is really strong there as well, especially in the digital space where these things last forever, right? You can get a comment on something a month later, 2 months later, and how do you handle that? So I'll get to your thing in a sec. So one of the things I do want to mention is Dwight mentioned that our social media toolkit is in your thumb drives. And one of the reasons that kit was developed was to address some of those questions. A lot of the kit is built of guidelines that we've utilized with these social media platforms. And they talk about, one, how to identify social media posts that are from somebody in crisis, how to identify whether a post is at imminent, is by somebody that might be at a level where you might have to call for crisis intervention services, and then how do you engage that person online with the understanding that you're not a mental health professional. We don't expect you to be when you read these kits, and that this is more to help drive people to resources and provide support and give you some kind of guidance on how to handle that and recommendations for what you can have that lives online to provide people with support. So it's specifically for digital community managers and social media managers and was written that way. So of course we'd love your feedback on that when you get a chance. But for the breaking news item, sure, right? that's really difficult. And we run into that as well, where we see these reports filter through, the hashtag comes in with the person's name, and all the theories pop in, especially before things are actually even necessarily verified. You already have the messaging going out saying that this what happened, somebody died by suicide, it happened in this way, and that's rough because you're also competing with a lot of sources who may not necessarily have the scruples or the background that you do when you're reporting these things, and they're just retweeting messages that come out. So what we do in those situations is we identify those hashtags, and then we also put out messages related to loss and support and resources. So I understand that sometimes you may not be able to avoid the 140 character message that has to come out. But as John mentioned earlier, trying to find ways to kind of be factual without being sensational, not having the means take away from your very minimal character count, and using that space to try to find a way to also include some kind of message of support and support resources. Sometimes that might mean trying to squeeze it in, right? Sometimes that might not be possible, and then there are times when you can kind of chain these messages together. Having like a quote tweet that follows up that says like, hey, this story is happening, but at the same time, if you are concerned about something, if you are worried about somebody else, if you are in crisis, there are these other resources. And having those resources be kind of catered to the medium that you're sending them through. So if it's a text line that might be helpful if you're sending a phone message, or a website that might be helpful if you know that this story is going to live somewhere else, or an end card on a digital story that you're breaking. All those different ways to kind of include those resources regularly every time you have to send these messages.
Sure. And we also talked about, obviously we're all very competitive in nature. We love our website clicks. We love people watching us on the air. We talked about establishing a toolkit on your own website, so you can kind of always have something to go back to, whether that be in a social media post or in a separate article. So you can kind of talk through what kind of toolkits should be, or what kind of tools should be included in that link.
Right, yeah, because I understand that a lot of this is about keeping people on your platforms. You don't want to drive them to a resource that isn't necessarily yours, or it would be helpful to have something that drives them to your own materials and resources, and you don't want to necessarily drive people to links that might be broken next week, right? And then that influences a lot of factors regarding your stories. So there's something in the kit that talks about building what we call a digital resource bank, right? So having a page on your site that lists recommended resources, resources that you trust, both locally and nationally, that you can refer people to, so that when you're linking, when you're providing that messaging on your stories that says, hey, if you're in crisis, call the Lifeline, you can also include a link that says you can also visit these resources on our own site, that have been recommended to us, that that we work with regularly and that we trust. And then that way, you also can fill that in with as many resources as you want, and you can get as specialized as you want too, so that if you're talking about a very specific population, you can have those specific resources on your site. For instance, if you're talking about the LGBTQ population, you can have the Trevor Project listed, you can have Trans Lifeline listed, any local resources in your area that deal specifically with these groups. And then that way, not only are you having a resource bank that you don't necessarily have to research every time, you have to put this story out and put it out very quickly, but you also have this nuance involved with being able to list very sensitive resources for different groups.
Sure, and we all know that a TV audience is quite a bit different from a newspaper audience, which is different, or from a digital audience as well. Can you kind of talk about the resources that you guys use with Facebook and Google Home and other, what are they called? Just the general Google Home, Google Home-esque devices, right, and Amazon Echo.
Voice-assisted something, yes.
Yeah.
So we've worked with a lot of these platforms and technologies to kind of build in that kind of resource component into them. So for instance, if somebody searches for a term on Google related to suicide, I want to die, something like that, there's a one box that pops up that gives you the Lifeline phone number, the Lifeline website, and essentially tells you, hey, you're not alone, there is help available for you. John mentioned earlier Facebook's reporting and supporting processes as well. Almost every major social media platform has some kind of reporting process that you can also utilize in addition to engage in supportive messaging, where they will look at that message, evaluate it, and then either remove it or reach out depending on what their policies are. Those currently live on the Lifeline site, but they change sometimes regularly, and that'll be something that your community managers may have to brush up on every once in a while. Make sure that that's something that I think all journalists should be familiar with, so that when they're encountering these things, they can also utilize the built-in system that may already be there. Something else that's interesting is that, for instance, if you ask Siri, if you ask Alexa, you say something about, I'm feeling suicidal, I want to die, they will actually then give you also supportive messaging and direct you to call the Lifeline as well. So that's something that we worked with a lot of these groups to develop, and it's something that is actually also growing over time, trying to find new ways to provide those supports with the knowledge that there are people who do confide in and talk to their voice assistants, and then what does that entail, what does that look like, and how much support can this develop and you can provide through these things. So there's a lot of, because a lot of John mentioned the reporting guidelines that were developed in 2010, which, as you know, in the digital space is like a lifetime away. And those reporting on suicide guidelines were adapted into what's called blogging on suicide guidelines, which include a lot of helpful materials, but also by the name itself, blogging on suicide, you can tell that this was written, around the same time, because I don't know anyone who uses that word blogging anymore. But so these types of guidelines are things that we want to keep building and identifying, and that we have to keep adapting as these changes move on. But something that is always consistent, regardless of the medium, is providing those resources, is providing those stories of hope and recovery, and ways that people can support each other, and kind of trying to be a bit vigilant. I mean, the problem and joy of social media is that it is 24/7. So having to have a policy for your newsroom that says, how often are we checking on these comments on these posts? How long will we engage with somebody before we think like, okay, this may not be, we may need to report this in a different way or call someone. All those things should be hashed out and decided before you encounter something like this, because then it's just way more terrifying in the moment than having the policy that you can rely on and refer to.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to say, maybe you can queue up the notebook that you have, the digital toolbox.
Oh, like it?
I was just going to mention, kind of moving forward in the digital space, when we do deal with these kinds of stories, I think it's really smart to, if you have like a tweet thread of the breaking news conversation that's happening right now, just to keep it going, and then eventually have a lifeline or a website included in that conversation where people can always kind of see it when they scroll up. And then on a space like Facebook, then you can pin a comment, if you're having thoughts of suicide, and I'm not the professional on this, so don't use any of my words on this. But I think it'd be great if we had some kind of specialized language, 140 characters or less, that all of us can kind of have in our back pocket, be ready to pull out, whether that be on digital spaces or on the air. I think that'd be awesome, just to kind of be on the same page.
Yeah, definitely. We have those messages that are in the kit listed. Something else that would be helpful is a lot of the Lifeline also puts out messages in these times. The Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention also puts out messages in these times that are just really easy to straight up copy. Like, lift it, we're cool with that. Lift it, quote it, use it. A lot of the messaging follows the same sort of very similar pattern, which is to kind of empathize with the person, and then provide a resource. So always kind of redirecting that person to people that are better suited to help. But also acknowledging that this person is reaching out to you for that kind of help, because you wrote this piece, they feel that you may have an understanding of them, and that they're more comfortable to reach out in the space that's actually semi-anonymous, which I know presents its own unique problems related to how much of their profile is accurate, or is the picture even accurate? Are they even where they say that they live? And all those things add a degree of uncertainty that can be really frustrating, and that's when utilizing those resources and utilizing the platforms, reporting mechanisms that you're on can be really helpful.
Awesome. I'm kind of out of questions, but I would love for anybody else to chime in if they have anything. Nope.
Can you talk a little bit about suggestions for writing headlines on stories that have to do with...
Oh, you actually reminded me of something I was going to mention when I was doing some research earlier, so thank you. I was just going to mention, The selection of photos and, like you said, headlines and certain wording in breaking news situations seems to be pretty important. Not showing pictures of Anthony Bourdain looking sad or in the dark or black and white, or blaming it on the fact that he had a turbulent relationship or whatever it may be. I think that's a really interesting angle to keep in mind. Just because for us in the digital space, it's so easy to jump to conclusions and see the TMZ article and see, you know, he attempted suicide doing this already, and then try to report on that, which doesn't seem to be forwarding anything and doesn't seem to benefit anybody in the first place.
I know that there's an extra component there regarding SEO and search terms that you're also wrestling with when you write these headlines. Those guidelines that John mentioned earlier are still things that we would advise that you utilize in this space, regardless of, you know, where you are. Using a person's name is not necessarily a problem in these things. Like, you're going to have people look for the person's name if this is a famous person, and then have your story ideally pop up in that case. But you also have those lines that pop up in Google search results, where you have that first line, second line of a story. And then that is also something to keep in mind when you're writing stories, and kind of avoiding mentioning of means in that first, you know, the first area, essentially. You may also maybe want to consider, if you're driving people to a page, how your pages are designed. You know, is there a section, you know, kind of early on near that headline where you can include, you know, your resource link? Instead of necessarily, I know standard right now is at the bottom, but that's not something that we necessarily have to do. We all know people don't necessarily get to the bottom. So can we move that higher in some way?
So earlier Facebook was talked about, but what about Instagram and other platforms, and how are they addressing the issue?
So the way Instagram and Twitter work right now is that they don't necessarily have a process that is as ranged in scope as Facebook, the larger Facebook platform, has right now. So what it is if you go onto Instagram or on Twitter, you see the message, you see the tweet, there is those 3 dots on Instagram that you use to, you know, report. And it's currently filed under kind of the same list of things. It's like, is this spam? Is this you know, concerning? Is it in some way? And then you go to, yes, this concerns me, and then this post includes some a method of self-harm and suicide. And then after that, they kind of evaluate those posts and then get back to you with, yes, we agree, we've removed this. Those are things that those are processes that are necessary, but that's also definitely not the only thing that we think is possible. Right? So we talk about sharing stories of hope and recovery, and talk about sharing resources, and those are all things that we think all platforms can do more of as well. It's just and in addition to just removing something, how do you further that conversation? How do you provide that person additional support? And that is a unique conundrum, considering privacy concerns and fake profiles and all of those things.
Thank you so much, and Francis, thank you for the work on the toolkit. It's really cool. I want to say, while these guys are coming up, these are hard issues to talk about, and it can also be really challenging for folks who've experienced distress or have friends or relatives do. If you're feeling like this isn't comfortable, then we have some of the best resources in America in the room. John and Emily. Emily, can you raise your hand and wave? Or, of course, so if we can find a quiet place if you want to talk, or, of course, you can also check in with the Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK, 8255. We're there right now and every day. So please feel free to take advantage of that. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, I think, Nigel.
Thanks. I'm Nigel Jaquith. I'm a reporter at Willamette Week.
I'm Sheila Hamilton. I'm an author, former TV and radio journalist, and I currently have a mental health blog and a podcast.
Hi, I'm Shelby Rowe. I'm the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services Suicide Prevention Program Manager. I'm also on this panel because I am a suicide attempt survivor.
Great, so we'll just get started. I'm going to ask these two far more knowledgeable people than I am some questions. I wanted to just sort of start by saying, when Dwight asked me to do this, I did some reading and I got a chance to talk to John and to Joey earlier this week, so I know a lot more than I did a few weeks ago. I still don't know much of anything. And as I've heard people talk today, I've been struck by a couple of fundamental challenges for somebody like me who's a reporter. One of them is no secret to anybody in this room, and that's that we all exist in a very competitive business where we're being asked to produce more content with fewer resources. The thing Therese mentioned about many of our readers now expecting to see the full Monty. They want to see if there's a dead body, they want to see that body, and they want to know how the person died, I think puts an additional challenge in front of us. The second thing is I've heard a lot about the importance of talking about resources and telling positive stories. The reality for many of us is that news, particularly if it's not breaking news, is driven by conflict. It's driven by the need to show not just stories about hope and recovery, but stories that illustrate real problems that require solutions. And so that, I think, in many ways brings us back to having to report about unpleasant subjects in order to try and compel policymakers to make changes. So with that sort of lead into how everybody should feel sorry for reporters because our job is so hard, I want to ask some questions about how we might better report on both suicide and attempts. So let me start by asking Shelby, who is a survivor, the question that I'm sure she thinks I shouldn't ask her first, which is, how long did it take for you to talk publicly about trying to kill yourself, and what compelled you to make that step?
So it took about 4 years. And I think that part of that is, one, just the healing that takes place. Being in a spot of hopelessness, helplessness, and despair, this isn't a fun, comfortable place to be. And it's one that, frankly, I didn't really feel I had the good vocabulary for. I work in the field. I've worked in the field of suicide prevention since 2007. I've worked in public health since '94. And in 2010, I made a suicide attempt. And so I was already working in the field. I stayed in the field. My role shifted. I changed jobs. But I needed time to heal. And then I really, I'm an advocate of, there are good stories that should be told that aren't being told. And when the Way Forward document came out, if you all look, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, they had a task force on suicide attempt survivors, and what should be the goal in suicide prevention, and how can this population finally have a seat at the table? And there were all of these recommendations, and there was a call, people should be telling their stories. And it kind of nagged at my conscience. And it's like, I'm more one, like, we should show people what to do, be that role model instead of shooting on them. And so I came forward, not because I thought I had this sexy, glamorous story to tell, but because I knew it was really important for suicide prevention for those stories to be told. And so, well, why am I not telling my story? So I will tell my story until more people fill the space. So being here to let people know that it's safe, that you can tell your story and still be treated with dignity and respect.
Great, thank you. Sheila, you've talked about how the details of your late husband's death were inaccurately reported. Could you tell us how that made you feel, and also how you got the facts that were incorrect corrected eventually?
So my husband died in December of 2006, and this was long before a lot of internet-related blogs or celebrity blogs, but we happened to have one here in Portland. And the day after he died, somebody forwarded me an internet link to a report that named him, that claimed that we were still married, we were separated, we had been in a really difficult mental health crisis with him for almost a year and a half. And they recounted where he was at the time of the attempt. They recounted where he was at the time of the death. There were several mistakes that were made in the case of the reporting, and the most galling thing to me as a reporter is that the reporter hadn't reached out to me. They'd taken it all from hearsay from people that were where my husband was found. That the link was forwarded to me, but even worse, it was forwarded to my daughter's school. And my daughter's school, which didn't really know how to handle death by suicide, ended up putting out an announcement before talking with us. And so you began to see that the cascading effect for survivors of these instances is really devastating, because when a family hasn't attempted or had the time to be able to put together the information about what actually happened and how complicated the circumstances were leading up to their death, it's almost like being behind this truckload and this avalanche of misinformation becomes another crisis. It becomes another trauma. I worked for years to try to get the person who created this link to take it down, because it had so many inaccuracies, but she'd gone out of business and it didn't really matter, but it did matter on Google searches. And so I think these personal experiences are so important to communicate to you that what you do is impacting people's lives. It's impacting the daughters and the sons and the aunts and the grandmothers and the people in the neighborhood and the schools. And so everything that you report really does have consequence.
Shelby, again, I know you've talked to me privately and here a few moments ago about your reluctance to talk and needing to have a healing process, and yet you've also said that it's important for people to hear stories of survivors. So when reporters are trying to approach survivors, what are some things that you would suggest that they might do in order to make that conversation first happen at all, and secondly happen successfully in a way that's beneficial for everybody?
So I think that one thing is, the story is in the recovery. And so one is finding those individuals who are in recovery, who are recovering. The story, so I wouldn't recommend, hanging out near psychiatric inpatient facilities and catching people when they walk out the door. But to find people in recovery, events like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has Out of the Darkness walks in pretty much every community in the country. That is a great place, if you're a reporter, to go find survivors that are in recovery. They are there surrounded by their friends and family. They are all the warm, fuzzy stories of recovery, the comeback kid stories, the recovery after loss, the recovery and healing, individuals who have struggled with thoughts of suicide, and they're there with their mother, their father, their children. It's like, this is how I built a life worth living, and we're here today celebrating my life. So those events are really easy to go find someone. They hold them in the fall. They hold them on college campuses in the spring. October 6th. Go and find thousands of stories of hope and recovery. Contact Lines for Life. I would recommend contact an organization, because a survivor that is at a point where they're celebrating their recovery, that's the story that you want to tell. Because that's the story of hope and healing. As John mentioned, of shifting the conversation to prevention, we want to share the stories of hope and healing. There's enough hopelessness out there around suicide. And I'd mentioned to you a statistic that I've been quoting everywhere anytime I get a microphone. I looked up survival rates for a lot of the leading killers of Americans. Suicide, those individuals who survive a suicide attempt have a 93% survival rate. 70% will not go on to have a second attempt. Suicide is survivable. Those are the stories we should be telling. Because it's important for an individual at risk to know they can survive this. It's important for their families to know they can survive this. The message we give on heart attacks is so much better. Heart attacks only have a 56% survival rate. It's literally a coin toss if you're going to live or not. But that's not the message we share. So we need to start talking about suicide for prevention, the way we talk about heart-healthy lifestyles. So I need your help with that.
So one of the issues that I might posit that prevents us or has prevented us from talking about recovery in the same way that we might talk about recovering from heart disease is that there is grieving and shame. There's a whole complex range of emotions that would seem to surround an attempt or someone taking his or her life. So, Sheila, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What compelled you to not only try to correct the record, but to then take the step of writing a book about David?
I felt like, well, first of all, I think that if you're not in this field, if you aren't really prepared with the language of mental health and suicide, when it happens in your family, as it happened in mine, I was shocked. I didn't know anything about suicide. I knew people who might have known other people. I thought it was something that scientists and poets did, and so I had a huge education. And I think when I learned that 50% of Americans know someone who has died by suicide, I realized, wow, we are all in this together. And they're not just scientists, and they're not just poets. They're brothers and sisters and aunts and moms and dads. And as my husband was, a brilliant designer builder who developed really strange cognitive problems late in life, and we learned he had bipolar disorder. This is a complicated story to tell, and what I felt was that almost like the viral telling of my story made his life a suicide, when in fact he was a loving father and a beautiful man and such a generous person who on stormy days would drive his truck around to other people in our neighborhood and deliver them eggs and milk and bread. He was a complete human. And I think when I've been in newsrooms since then and I hear somebody shout out, "There's a jumper on the bridge," it kills me, because I think that's somebody's brother, that's someone's son, it's someone's dad. And I wrote about it as an attempt to bring the love and light back to his life. I wanted people to understand what a complex and beautiful mind he had and how hard he tried to overcome his mental health problem. And I think if, as journalists, we can look at these stories not in that moment of impulse or despair, but we can look at the complexity of their lives and the beauty that they bring to their lives, we can tell whole stories. We can tell stories we're all familiar with, because we all struggle. We're all going to have moments of despair, and it's how we get through it that I think is really, really important.
Shelby, I think everybody in this room who's been a reporter has asked a really stupid question, or a question that they really wish they hadn't asked in retrospect. Could you tell us about an interaction that you've had with a reporter, or if you didn't have it directly yourself that you're aware of, a teachable moment for all of us in the room?
Yes, and Sheila kind of said it well, is that, individuals who have lost someone they love, or individuals who have survived themselves like me, are real people, three-dimensional people with full lives. And so I've been pretty fortunate, but I'm pretty selective on who I talk to, and when they're like, what is your story, what is the angle? Because if they just want, if they're spreading hopelessness or something, I don't want to talk to them. Or if they insist on knowing the method, if they don't want to hear my story of recovery, they just want to hear the pain, I don't want to talk to them. And so when I've been really fortunate, but I've set those boundaries. And I know that I don't have to share my story with everyone who wants to hear it. It's my story that I own. And so individuals, when I see other survivors who share their story, and then, which I understand you all are in a tough dilemma, but to get that clickbait, that they've kind of made that person a caricature. And so they walk away. So I think when they're reading the story, it's like, is this still a whole person? And if it's not, you've furthered that stigma. You know, when we think about AIDS and things the way it was covered in the 80s, totally different than stories now about Magic Johnson and other things. Like, is this a person living through this health crisis and recovering? Or is this person dark, scary, dangerous? Because most of us are not dark, scary, dangerous. We're really pretty boring, ordinary folks who have extraordinary recovery stories.
I think you told me that a couple of stories that were written about you in Oklahoma didn't run. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's been the opportunity, you know, for me to share my story, and I've had a couple times, and they were actually with national publications, where a reporter interviewed me, heard my story, and it's different making yourself vulnerable in front of a room full of people because you have a little bit of control. Like, I usually call that, in my mind, I call it emotional burlesque. You know, I want to be intimate enough and revealing enough that it engages the audience and they want to pay attention, but protect them. And I've had reporters call me back and say, hey, Shelby, I just want to let you know, I'm killing the story. I'm pulling the story because when I got it back from my editor, you weren't a whole person anymore. And I'm just going to pull it. I don't feel good about it anymore. And that meant so much to me. I'm sure it was hard for them. They'd worked on the story. But I would much rather it not be told than to have myself reduced to not being a whole person. So you know, when they asked, like, great. And I said, well, let me hear your story. And I love it. They go, tell me your story, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. So I'd say just let them. Don't create that box, because when you ask really directed questions, you might miss some really cool stuff that you wouldn't know if you just stick with your investigative questions. If you go, tell me your story, let them unfold their story, and then you can ask follow-up questions. So that's been most respectful. I've had really good experiences. I know there's a lot of people that have had terrible experiences. I'm really selective of who I talk to, and so I haven't had the bad experiences that others have. But I think I didn't lose my first husband to suicide, but I lost him in an accidental shooting. And so with reporting, and then I ended up writing a paper in college on the exploitation of crime victims by the media and how you can tell a newsworthy story without exploiting and causing further trauma to victims. And so I took that with me into this work. And then there's others like me who are now training other survivors on how to tell their stories safely.
I'd also just want to tag on to what she said. We developed an interview series in the Skype Live studio for a few years where we were talking with musicians and artists about how they stay well, if they've had drug or alcohol abuse problems, how they stay in recovery, and asking them how they stay well often led to the really interesting story of when they were sick. And I think backing into it like that is really an intriguing way for journalists to think about it, because most of us have had to develop coping mechanisms for our health. We do things to keep ourselves healthy. And then if you begin to feel an intimacy with the person talking with you, you often reveal why. And it's a wonderful way to actually develop a kind of intimacy with people and an honesty with your interviewer.
Thanks. So maybe this is a direct follow-up to that. I mean, we'll all face situations where we have to make a call or a contact or go to somebody's doorstep where we don't want to be there, where your editor has said, gee, a prominent person in our community has died. We're not sure of the circumstances, or we may know it's a suicide. We'd like you to go get that story. And I've had a couple of those occasions where I've been notably unsuccessful, and I imagine we all have as reporters. I'd be curious as to what you think a reporter could do, Sheila and Shelby, if they came and knocked on your door or came to your place of work or called you, or first of all, which of those approaches might be most successful, or how would you guide us to approach families that are grieving and have no real desire to be approached?
I had to do this so often in my career with veterans, kids who died, and talking with their parents, or people who were quite famous in the community and had died of cancer, and speak to them. Nobody in that moment of grief really wants the first thing they do to be talking to a reporter. But my own method was always to ask the question about their lives, not about the manner of death, not about how they died, but about how they lived. And if I led with the focus that I actually do want to do this story on who this person was, it almost inevitably followed that they were really, really welcoming. So I haven't had a lot of times when people turn me away, except when there's sort of a group mentality, that kind of, we're on deadline and you've got to respond to me in 15 minutes. That's just earth-shattering for a person who's just lost someone they love. But if you can do it sensitively, reach out to a family member or someone you know through their social media sites, tell them that you want to focus on the manner in which the way they lived, I think that's a much more positive way to go about it.
I agree 100% with say to ask, what do you want people to know? Like, the story's going to run. What would you like to say? Tell us about your loved one who died, and what do you want people to know about their death, and let them, and then you can ask follow-up questions. But I think if you ask those, I think one question to avoid, which is really clear and we want to ask right away, is why? It's really complex why, and the only person, people in Sheila's, the only person who knows why that person died is no longer with us. And so that's a question they're going to keep asking. And so asking that question will instantly put them on the defense. Or for me, like, well, how long do you have for me to tell you why I was at risk? It's a lifetime worth of factors and trauma that put me at risk. If you don't have time to listen to that, I'm not going to give you a one-sentence answer. So let's talk about other things. Let's talk about how I'm well, what I do to stay well, if you don't have time to listen to what put me at risk.
Great. There are a lot of smart people in this room who've got questions, so let's open the floor to questions from the audience. Come on, did I overrate you guys?
We run out of coffee. So, Shelby, before we got started today, you and I were talking a little bit, and you mentioned something you've been paying a lot of attention to lately, post-traumatic growth. Can I ask about that? You want to talk about that, or maybe not?
Sure. And then, we asked the question, and then, I would say Google post-traumatic growth, because I have not had enough coffee to be able to list all of the 5 measurable domains.
So
but,
I wasn't going to put you on that spot,
okay.
but if you could
I'm pretty nerdy, so
conceptually tell these guys a little bit about that, because I thought that was just super interesting, and it was something that was new to me that I think a lot of people here would probably find pretty interesting.
Okay, so there has been research done, after significant traumatic events, large populations that they've researched post-traumatic growth would be things like 9/11 or the Madrid train bombing. They've researched it in cancer survivors, individuals who survived trauma, and then measuring that psychological growth that can take place. Yes, there's trauma, and post-traumatic stress is real. PTSD is real. I've been diagnosed with PTSD since I was 19. But there's also post-traumatic growth. And so with measuring that, if you Google it, like, there's a website, there's great research, there's some books. And so they've researched post-traumatic growth in suicide loss survivors. And I'm working with a researcher, and there's a few other researchers who are trying to measure post-traumatic growth in suicide attempt survivors. And it's something that anecdotally, those of us who have survived it can talk about, hey, this is how my life changed. This is how my life became better, more meaningful. If losing those human connections, if losing that sense of purpose can put you in a life-threatening crisis, you develop super strong personal connections and really tangible connections to your personal purpose. There's growth that takes place. There's spiritual growth, deeper appreciation for life, meaningful, and there's a fearlessness, because once you've lost everything that you thought you were and you have to build a new worldview, you're not scared of losing those things anymore. One of the signs of my healing personally, which is why I'm working with a researcher, Dr. Melinda Moore, to measure post-traumatic growth in other attempt survivors, because we've all been talking about it, but stories are just stories until you can measure that. So we're trying to measure it. I left my job. I was the executive director for our crisis center, so the Lines for Life in Arkansas, that's what I did. And I left it to start a nonprofit that I wanted to work with veterans with PTSD and with horses. And so I had a lot of my colleagues go, I can't believe that's so brave of you, that you would leave your steady job and do this. And I said, well, there's like, what if you fail? And it's like, I've already failed worse than I ever thought possible. Like, I have failed so hard, I didn't think I would even survive it. And yet, here I am. So I'm not afraid of failing. Like, so what if I fail? As long as I survive, I can get through it. I can do something else. And so there's this fearlessness that they find in individuals who survive cancer, that they find in people who survive 9/11, that you develop this purpose. Look it up. It's really fascinating. It's kind of the opposite of resilience. Individuals who are extremely resilient don't experience a lot of post-traumatic growth, because when they experience trauma, it doesn't shatter their assumptive worldview. Both of them are strengths, both of them very resilient, but it's two totally separate concepts. So look it up. Some individuals are born resilient, are just those shiny rubber balls, and they have beautiful life stories. And others experience post-traumatic growth, where they were totally broken down, lost what they thought was their core, and then what they rebuilt. Yeah, I could keep talking forever about that, but I won't. Google it.
I don't know if this is still on, but I just wanted to say one thing, and it kind of ran counter to the idea that speaking about or reporting on suicide causes contagion. And I give a lot of speeches to high school kids, and we had a cluster up in Southwest Washington of 6 kids, and the school wasn't talking about it. They'd forbidden any mention of the names of the kids. There was a real strange thing that was happening. One of the teachers invited me to come speak, and I asked 600 kids how many of them had lost someone to suicide that they loved. Every hand in the audience was up. I asked them how many of them knew the names of the kids who'd recently died. Every hand went up. Our kids, our community members, when there are these clusters, they all know what's going on. I think that our charge as journalists and as people who care about the strength of our communities is to find a way to actually communicate the hope and the resilience and the efforts and the post-traumatic growth that's out there. We can't pretend that not speaking about this is going to do anything to help this crisis, and it is a public health crisis. We have to actually approach it from the point of view that we have the skills to actually help, especially these kids.
And I think I want to add, to look, what are you selling? In your stories that are online, if people don't read your stories, your newspaper doesn't sell, your news network goes out of business. So each article is, what are you selling? And so I was like, in your stories about suicide, sell hope, sell solutions. You may need the hook. You may need the statistic. Rates went up 10% or rates went up 50%. But then make the bulk of your story, here's the solution. Here's what we can do about it. Here's the action steps. Sell life. Please stop selling death. We've got enough of that.
Wow, Shelby, that was powerful. Thank you. Did you have a question? Did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up. No? Okay. John or Joey, did you want to get in? And then we'll close out in just a second. But
Shelby, we were talking earlier, and you had mentioned that there were you had strong feelings about journalists saying they needed to include how someone, the how, and so I'd love for you to share that.
Okay, yes, on their soapbox. So, and I understand, and it is that curiosity of, well, how? And it's like, well, we've got to report it. And I would say, really, you don't. If you have a celebrity that dies of cancer, do you really report, well, they laid in their bed and they were emaciated and they were in hospice care and they starved to death and no, you don't put that. When you say, someone was raped, you say they were raped. You don't graphically describe the rape. When someone dies, that they died by suicide, that is graphic enough in and of itself. So I would resist the temptation to give into that morbid curiosity, to do the trauma porn. There's going to be someone that does it, but you don't have to. You can still do good journalism and not give that, because you don't give graphic descriptions of how other people die of heart attacks or aneurysms. You don't need to give graphic detail, because that person's children are going to have to read that, their spouse, everyone who loves them, and that helps complicate that grief process, and that's not the story.
I'd like to just add that everybody who reported on the ways in which Robin Williams died missed the story that he had an advanced brain disorder. So when they said he hung himself, they really missed that he was suffering from a really difficult brain disorder. And unless you're going back and you're doing the complicated follow-up stories to say that this disorder can give you suicidal ideation, you haven't done your job. There's also, just for me, when people ask how he died, I say my husband died because he lost a prolonged battle to mental illness. And that's the truth.
Well, I think we'll end there. I want to say thanks to everybody for coming. I want to say thanks for everybody for being so engaged. It's a really remarkable effort. Thanks to this panel, first of all. I knew when we put these folks together, we'd have some really powerful insights. I had saved a few minutes at the end for kind of action planning and action items, and I think we have our action item. I heard from a number of you in the room after right at the break about how we start to organize a collaborative effort around a media collaborative effort. We're obviously, that's not our role. We're just a nonprofit, but we're happy to help and support. Sarah from OPB offered to host the first meeting about it, and Therese and John, and lots of us talked about it already, Les. So we'll be calling on you. We'll be cashing in that chit to get you engaged in helping us precipitate that and herd the cats that are the Oregon journalism team. Thanks again to everybody who made this possible. It was really, this is beyond my wildest dreams for a professional wedding. My personal wedding was better, but for a professional wedding, it couldn't have been better. Thank you all very, very much.